Welcome back to Late Edition. Our residents from various areas in and around parts of Cape Town have voiced concerns about the escalating sex trade in Cape Town's red light district. 8 ratepayers associations have come together to take action against the operators who are allegedly buying up properties to create illegal brothels and boarding houses. Complaints coming from residents on these illegal establishments are from namely Milnerton, Summer Greens, Sanddrift, Brooklyn, Ysterplaat, Rugby, Phoenix and Tijgerhof. The ratepayers associations have since handed a memorandum of concerns to Deputy Mayor Eddie Andrews. Andrews confirmed that 160 properties were set to be investigated. Well, for more on this, we now are very pleased to be joined by international consultant as well as research fellow of the Free State Center for Human Rights, Dr. Marcel Van der Watt, to hear more about the findings. Doctor, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Doc, do you think this is just the Western Cape residential associations that are actually making such complaints, or do you think this could possibly be a countrywide issue?
Hi, good evening, Alicia, and to the viewers. I think it's always been a countrywide issue, but I want to start off with a critical caveat to this whole conversation. I think the conversation should shift away from the individual women, people who, who sell sex. I think it's not so much about them as being a quote-unquote problem, rather than it is the system of prostitution that brings with it inequality, gender-based violence, absolute male entitlement, lawlessness, and just societal decay. So I think it's very important that we see this as a system that has found its roots into most communities in South Africa, and those complaints have been coming for a very long time already. And
Doctor, I mean, what do you, please give us an overview. I mean, you have been advocating for a lot around sex trade. Give us an overview of what you can attest this to. Do you think there are serious mitigating factors for sex workers to now just be brazenly and openly plying their trade without the relevant legislations, even though the talks have literally come to a standstill? There's no forward-going plans in relation to the decriminalization of sex work as well as sex trade in this country?
I think the first thing to clarify, again, a critical segue, Alicia, is there's a very big difference. When we're talking about decriminalization of prostitution, and there's a reason I don't use the word sex work, right? The reason I'm not using that word, Alicia, is because survivors of the sex trade, many women in prostitution, and some prominent human rights bodies find that word incredibly offensive to suggest that this is a word. So I'm not going to use that word, but in terms of the movement going forward, it's so important to understand what decriminalization is. There's full decriminalization and there's partial decriminalization. Now, partial decriminalization is really based on equality. It's where we say, okay, women and those selling are part of a system and are part of a marginalized community that's kind of relegated to that space because of a lot of things: joblessness, lack of education, poverty, etc. But let's fully go after consumer level demand. And those models have been very, very successfully employed in countries like Ireland and the Scandinavian countries and Canada. But now what the government is proposing, Alicia, is legalize everything: pimping, brothels, the sex buying, third-party facilitators, and I think it's unimaginable the harm that is awaiting South African societies should this law go through. It's not there yet, and the public still have an opportunity to engage with the process going forward.
And Doctor, I mean, while you're there, I mean, let's take into account that a lot of these, maybe you will go back to what word you would like us to use in order to address these workers. But I mean, we need to take into account that a lot of these workers on the streets are actually human trafficked. These people are not doing it there by themselves. As you've just mentioned, the pimps will be waiting there. So obviously there is a general push for these people to come back with some sort of remuneration in order for them to stay in the trade. So what types of discussions and movements do we need to then curtail around that, Doc?
I firstly want to shout out and commend you for what you just said, Alicia, because you are so absolutely right. There is this spectrum of exploitation, Alicia, and many of these women, frankly, don't even know that they are being trafficked.
Absolutely.
You know, we've got a lot of lobby groups and a lot of people that advocate for these women, but these are PhDs and professors and even constitutional court judge. The minister, you know, the deputy minister of social development calls herself the chief sex worker, and it's just mind-boggling how we don't have an honest, sincere conversation about what's really happening. And you're so right. Many of these women are trafficked. They are in a situation where their position of vulnerability is fundamentally abused. And I mean, this trade, it feeds on vulnerability. So I think what we need to understand is, once we say to men, in a country like South Africa with pandemic, systemic levels of gender-based violence, okay, guys, now officially, legally, you can do what you've always been done. There was laws in the past and was some form of deterrence. Now we're saying, do whatever you want. And that, what by implication, Alicia, is we are going to see brothels flourishing in communities. Literally in the last 2 days, I've received complaints from 3 places in South Africa. I'm not even talking about what happened in Cape Town, what we're talking about now. Makeshift brothels, a tent, a little kind of a container key next to a shelter across the road from a court, just coming up, men going in and out. In full view of the public. I know a while back I had a lot of cases of pimps soliciting children and getting children to use their lunch money to pay for sex. Alicia, I don't think we fathom what will happen. It's not speculation. We've seen this happening in other parts of the world, towns, cities, counties in the United States. It's going to be horrendous. And final point, in the WhatsApp I sent yesterday to a couple of people, I told everybody apartheid was the nudge for intergenerational trauma 1.0, and South Africa is still dealing with the remnants of that. I will make a very bold statement. I will say, if prostitution becomes legal sex buying, entitlement by men, brothels, this will be the nudge for intergenerational trauma 2.0.
And in closing, Doc, I mean, while we're talking about men, I mean, the discussions are always, whenever you bring this topic up, it's always, well, the supply and the versus demand conundrum and narrative. So what are the solutions? What are the messages, the relevant messages that we should be pushing out to society, particularly also men that are directly involved in this trade?
Well, we need leaders to stand up and speak, right? I know, like Deputy Minister John Jeffrey, who is now, you know, the guy that is going to move this legislation forward, should it go through all the processes. I mean, the Deputy Minister has been entirely mum around the issue of sex buyers. Yet, a while back, he had this very great noble endeavor to have conversations under the trees with men and boys about manhood and men as partners. Why don't we include this, you know? So we need to have a conversation about what is going to be happening if this in fact happen. And every industry needs to be involved. Social development, businesses, all departments. Is going to affect Home Affairs work. South Africa is really going to become, if this happens, the brothel of Africa, and we will see more migrant populations, vulnerable populations being drawn to this industry, and the implications are enormous.
Doctor, before I let you go, back to the term and word, let's educate the nation. What word is the appropriate term to use when you address the workers?
Again, it's amazing. Just commending you, Alicia. It's a person. We're talking about human beings here. These are women. They are daughters. They are mothers. We should steer away, obviously, from the word prostitute. That's probably the most offensive word. Equally offensive to many of these survivors is the word sex work. We are talking about persons in prostitution or prostituted persons, and those are often the words that we use. There are many others, but I think chiefly those are the words, and the media should consider this and should understand that that inherent to this trade is physical, psychological, and emotional violence. So, last thing, can you even you know this whole thing we had about taking a girl child to work, Alicia?
Yes.
We all commended any job, mining, being a soldier, being a policeman. You can take a girl child to work. Do you agree with that, Alicia? Can you take a girl child to sex work?
Very profound.
You can't.
No,
Alicia.
you can't, Doctor. No.
Nobody will sign off on that. So let's start to have a sober conversation about this, and let's call on President Cyril Ramaphosa in terms of Section 84 2G of the Constitution to call for a referendum on this. He can do that.
Doctor, thank you so much for your insights this evening. Thank you so much. Hope to see you back in the country very soon. That is Dr. Marcel Van der Watt of the Free State Centre for Human Rights with us, of course, on the reported scourge of, as he says, of course, the traders in this business. These are people, these are humans, these are women that are working in a job that is not necessarily glamorized or glamorized. All right.